What would you do if 20 years of hard work was sinking into the mud and the only person offering help was someone you'd just mocked in front of your entire crew? What happened in an Iowa swamp in September 1992 will make you question everything you think you know about progress. The excavator had been sinking for 3 days. Christopher Anderson stood at the edge of the swamp on that Tuesday morning, watching 60 tons of yellow steel disappear inch by inch into black water. The Caterpillar 375 had cost $600,000. The cab was half submerged, now muddy water lapping at the windows, where Kevin Harris had been sitting Sunday morning when the ground gave way. The machine sat at an angle, tracks invisible beneath the surface hydraulic arm, reaching skyward like a drowning man's final gesture. Christopher was 45 years old, built solid from 2 decades of physical labor that money hadn't yet erased from his frame. His hands bore permanent dirt in the creases his face carried, lines the Iowa sun had carved deep. The hard hat sat tilted back on his head safety vest over a flannel shirt that had seen better mornings. He'd been standing here since dawn, watching the machine sink another half-inch while engineers shuffled blueprints and muttered about ground-penetrating radar. The Highway 52 expansion stretched behind him, $4 million worth of state contract and his company's biggest job. 6 months completed, 12 months remaining, and this swamp threatened to bury all of it. Heartland construction had started with nothing back in '72. One backhoe, one pickup truck, $8,000 borrowed from his father-in-law, who'd made it clear the money came with Patricia, not affection. Christopher had worked 18-hour days for 20 years, sleeping in that truck more nights than he'd slept in his own bed, eating cold sandwiches while other men went home to hot dinners. He'd built Heartland into an empire. 150 employees, $12 million in annual revenue, equipment worth $8 million parked in yards across eastern Iowa. People said if Christopher Anderson couldn't do it, it couldn't be done. The excavator had just proved people wrong. Kevin Harris had been operating equipment for 15 years. Sunday morning at 6:30, he'd climbed into that cab with coffee still warm in his thermos. The surveyors had marked this drainage area solid ground. Their instruments said so. Their computers confirmed it. The August heat had baked a crust over the earth that looked stable enough to build a shopping mall. Kevin had made 2 passes without incident. The third pass, the ground cracked, not a small crack, the kind of sound that makes a man's stomach drop before his brain catches up. The excavator punched through that dried crust like a fist through window glass, 60 tons dropping into bottomless muck beneath. Kevin had scrambled out the door while the machine was still falling, boots hitting mud, and running, not looking back, until he'd reached solid ground 50 feet away. Christopher had been at home when the call came. Sunday breakfast. Patricia had made pancakes. Amanda was complaining about volleyball practice. Brandon was reading some engineering textbook because 14-year-old boys who wanted to impress their fathers did things like that. The phone rang, Kevin's voice on the other end, shaking. Patricia had looked at him across the table. That look, the one that said, "This is more important than family, isn't it?" The one he'd been seeing more often the past 5 years as Heartland grew and home shrank. He'd grabbed his keys without finishing his coffee. The first rescue attempt had been straightforward. 2 Caterpillar D8 bulldozers, steel chains thick enough to hold a bridge. Christopher had watched the operators hook up engines, roaring black diesel smoke tracks biting into ground that should have been solid. Brandon had come along, said he wanted to see real engineering in action. The boy stood off to the side with a notebook, writing everything down. Like this was a classroom instead of a disaster. The chains had gone taut. Both bulldozers at full throttle, 90,000 pounds of drawbar, pull each steel links vibrating with tension. The excavator hadn't moved. Not an inch. The chains had screamed a sound metal makes when it's being asked to do the impossible. Brandon had been close when the first one snapped. Too close. The chain had whipped through the air with a crack like a gunshot, missing the boy's head by 3 feet, wrapping itself around a concrete barrier with enough force to dent the steel. Christopher's heart had stopped for a full second. His son standing there with wide eyes and a pale face, holding that stupid notebook. He'd wanted to grab the boy, shake him, ask him what the hell he thought he was doing standing that close. Instead, he'd turned back to the excavator. The second chain had snapped 10 minutes later. The excavator had sunk another inch. Day 2 brought professionals. Donald Moore ran Midwest Heavy Equipment Recovery out of Des Moines, 30 years, in the business, built like a barrel with arms that could bend rebar. He'd pulled locomotives out of ditches, out of rivers machinery, from places that defied physics. He'd arrived Monday morning with a Peterbilt recovery truck sporting a 50-ton hydraulic winch, the kind of equipment that made Christopher's bulldozers look like children's toys. They'd buried a concrete anchor block 200 yards back, 6 feet deep, poured specifically to hold against anything. Moore had run steel cable from the winch to the excavator 2 inches in diameter, rated for 100,000 pounds. The setup had taken 3 hours. The pull had taken 3 minutes. The winch had engaged with a high-pitched whine that set teeth on edge. The cable had stretched literally visible elongation steel molecules, rearranging themselves under impossible pressure. Christopher had watched the pressure gauge climb. 45,000 pounds, 60,000, 75,000. Donald Moore had glanced at him jaw tight. Christopher had said, "Keep pulling." 85,000 pounds. The concrete anchor block had shuddered. Then it had ripped out of the ground, 1.5 tons of concrete yanked from the earth like a bad tooth. The truck had lurched backward. The cable had snapped with a sound Christopher would hear in his sleep for weeks. The excavator had settled deeper, black water rising another 6 inches up the cab. That evening, he'd called the insurance company. The agent had put him on hold twice before delivering the news. Clause 7B excluded operator error resulting in submersion. The surveyor who'd marked the ground stable worked for Heartland, which meant the error was Christopher's responsibility. The claim was denied. $600,000 gone. Company cash reserves stood at $180,000. The numbers didn't work. Bankruptcy. 20 years building gone in 3 days because some surveyor trusted a computer more than the land. Patricia had driven to the site that night. She'd found him sitting in his truck, staring at the excavator through the windshield. She hadn't said "I told you so," which somehow made it worse. She'd just looked at him with those eyes that had seen him through 2 decades of marriage, through the hungry years, and the lean years, and the years when success started changing him into someone she didn't quite recognize. She'd asked, "Are we going to lose everything?" He'd promised he'd fix it. He always fixed things. That's what he did. That's who he was. Day 3 started before dawn. Jason Taylor brought a 150-ton mobile crane from Iowa City, the kind of machine that built skyscrapers and assembled factory equipment. The operator was 60. If he was a day 40 years running cranes, seen everything the Midwest could throw at machinery. Christopher had paid $3,500 just to get the crane to the site. Jason had walked the ground, didn't rush it, didn't listen to Christopher's assurances about stabilizer placement. The man had squatted 30 yards from the swamp's edge, pushed his hand into earth that looked solid. His hand had sunk 6 inches through dried crust into waterlogged soil beneath. He'd straightened, looked at Christopher, shaken his head. The crane wouldn't work. Ground wouldn't support it. Setting up a 150-ton machine on saturated earth meant 2 machines stuck instead of 1. Jason had climbed back in his cab and driven away, taking $3,500 for nothing but professional wisdom. That's when the John Deere had appeared. 10 o'clock Tuesday morning, the construction site had settled into a frustrated lull. 40 workers stood around with nothing to do. Equipment idled a $600,000 machine, mocking them from the swamp. Christopher had been standing with Matthew Clark, his youngest engineer, fresh from Purdue, with a head full of theories and a pocket full of calculators. They'd been discussing helicopter cranes. $15,000 an hour based in Minnesota would take half a day just to arrive. Brandon had spotted the tractor first. The boy had good eyes, always watching. He'd pointed down the county road where dust rose in a thin column. The dust had resolved into a green John Deere 4020 old model from the 70s, pulling nothing. Just a tractor on a Tuesday morning heading toward the site at a leisurely pace that suggested the driver had nowhere urgent to be. The tractor had turned into the construction area and stopped. The engine had shut off. A man had climbed down with the careful movements of someone whose bones had been working for 70-plus years. White male, maybe 5'10", built like wire instead of bulk. Faded denim overalls washed so many times the blue had gone gray. Work shirt with patches at the elbows, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms roped with muscle and veins. Boots that had been resoled at least twice leather, cracked and worn caked in soil that looked like it had been accumulating since the Eisenhower administration. The man's face told the real story, deeply lined, weathered by Iowa sun and Iowa wind and Iowa winters that could freeze diesel in the tank. Bright blue eyes that didn't miss much. A John Deere cap sweat-stained around the band bill, curved from decades of wear. His hands were calloused, gnarled, the kind of hands that had spent 50-plus years gripping tools and ropes and machinery that didn't come with instruction manuals. He'd walk toward the cluster of men near the swamp with a deliberate pace, not hurrying, not hesitating, just walking like he had every right to be there, which he probably did, given the farm visible across the fence line. White farmhouse, red barn grain silos rising against the horizon. Thompson land owned since before most people in Clayton County had been born. Christopher had barely glanced at him. The blueprints spread across the truck hood demanded attention. Helicopter crane logistics demanded solutions, and an old farmer wandering onto a construction site demanded nothing but a polite dismissal. The man had stopped a few feet away. His voice, when it came out, was calm, unhurried, the voice of someone who'd learned long ago that rushing rarely helped anything. "Morning, gentlemen." Christopher had looked up just long enough to establish eye contact. "Morning. Sites closed to visitors. Insurance liability." The man had nodded toward the fence line. "I'm not a visitor. I'm your neighbor. Own the land across that fence line." His hand had gestured east, where the farm sat clear in the September light. The White House looked freshly painted. The barn wore red paint that had faded but held. Thompson, 1887, was visible on the barn's side, black letters announcing a family that had been working this land for 105 years. Christopher had returned his attention to the blueprints. "We're working here." The man had stood quiet for a moment, looking at the excavator in the swamp, at the idle bulldozers, at the men standing around, with the particular frustration of people who'd run out of options. When he spoke again, his tone hadn't changed. Still calm, still unhurried. "I can see that. Saw your problem. Thought I might could help." The silence that fell had a quality to it. Matthew Clark had coughed, trying to suppress something that might have been a laugh. A worker 20 feet away had stopped mid-conversation. Brandon had looked up from whatever he'd been writing in that notebook, eyes sharp and interested. Christopher had straightened, giving the old man his full attention now. "Help how I can pull that machine out." The laugh had started somewhere in the back of the gathered crowd. Not loud, not mean, just the natural sound of men hearing something absurd offered with complete sincerity. Matthew Clark had pressed his hand to his mouth. Several workers had exchanged glances. Someone had made a sound that might have been a chuckle. Christopher had felt his mouth tugging into a smile, despite the disaster, soaking up company assets 50 yards away. "Pull it out. With what, Grandpa, you're John Deere." The man hadn't reacted to Grandpa. His expression hadn't changed, hadn't shown offense or anger or anything except that same patient calm, not with the John Deere, with my steam traction engine. Christopher's smile had widened. "Your what steam traction engine?" "Case model, 1912. 110 horsepower. Been in my family 80 years." The laughter had spread now. Matthew Clark had been outright chuckling. Workers had stopped what they were doing to listen. The sound had rippled through the crowd, 40 men who'd been frustrated and helpless, finding relief in something ridiculous enough to laugh at. A steam tractor from 1912, museum piece, antique, something their great-grandfathers might have used. Christopher had wiped his eyes. "Mr. Thompson, William Thompson, folks call me Bill." "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate the thought, but that's not going to work." Bill Thompson's face hadn't changed. "Why not?" "Because that excavator weighs 60 tons. Your steam tractor weighs, what, maybe 5 tons, 22 tons actually. And she's an engine, not a tractor." Matthew Clark had jumped in, voice still carrying amusement. "Okay, 22 tons. Mr. Anderson's bulldozers are 50 tons each. 2 of them couldn't budge that excavator. I watched them try." Christopher had felt something shift in his chest. This old man had been watching. For how long? 3 days, standing on his land, watching modern equipment fail, waiting to see if the experts would figure it out. The presumption of it touched something raw. So you understand why a smaller, older machine won't work. Bill Thompson had looked at the excavator, then at the bulldozers sitting useless at the swamp's edge, then back at Christopher. Smaller don't mean weaker, and older don't mean obsolete. Brandon had stepped forward. The boy's voice had carried that particular tone of teenage certainty mixed with genuine curiosity. "Dad, maybe we should listen." Christopher had cut him off with a look and a tone sharp enough to draw blood. "Brandon, this is business. Let the adults handle it." The boy had stepped back, face flushing. That notebook had dropped to his side. Patricia would have called Christopher out for that tone. She'd been calling him out for a lot lately. The way he dismissed people. The way success had made him believe his own mythology. The way he treated their son like an employee instead of family. But Patricia wasn't here. Just a swamp and a desperate situation and an old farmer with an absurd suggestion. Bill Thompson had waited through the exchange without comment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same patient quality. "Can I ask what your bulldozers make, horsepower-wise?" Matthew Clark had answered, still smiling. "Caterpillar D8, about 300 horsepower each, and they spun out trying to pull," Christopher had nodded. "The ground's too soft, tracks couldn't grip." Bill Thompson had nodded back, like this confirmed something he'd already known. "That's part of it. But there's more." The crowd had quieted. Something in the old man's tone suggested this wasn't just an old fool with an old machine. There was certainty there, knowledge, the kind that didn't come from books or computer screens. Bill Thompson's next words came out measured, each one chosen with care. "Your bulldozers make horsepower. Mine makes torque. They're not the same thing." Christopher had felt his patience fraying. "I know the difference between," the old man had continued, as if Christopher hadn't spoken, not rude, just explaining something that needed explaining. "Horsepower is how fast you can do work. It's about speed. RPMs. Your bulldozer engines spin at 1,800, 2,000 RPMs. Right?" Matthew Clark had answered, despite himself, genuine interest creeping into his voice. "D8, about 1950, RPM at full throttle. Right. Fast spinning, that's horsepower, great for pushing dirt on solid ground, moving fast, getting work done quick." Bill Thompson had paused, letting that sink in. The construction site had gone quiet enough to hear the breeze moving through the corn in the field across the road. "Torque is different. Torque is twisting force. It's how much work you can do regardless of speed. My steam engine runs at 200 revolutions per minute. Slow, but those pistons, they're driving through reduction gears. Every revolution of those pistons creates massive rotating force on the drive wheels." Brandon had been unable to help himself. The boy's voice had come out excited the way it did when something clicked in his mind. "So it's like gear ratio multiplication." Bill Thompson had smiled for the first time, a real smile that reached his eyes and changed his whole face. "Exactly, son. You study engineering, Iowa State. Want to. Second year high school, but I'm reading ahead. Then you understand. High gear ratio means low speed, but high torque? My engine's drive system goes pistons to crankshaft to reduction gears to wheels. By the time power reaches those 6-foot drive wheels, it's magnified 30 to 1. Christopher had felt the conversation slipping away from him. This was his disaster, his company, his problem to solve. An old farmer and a 14-year-old boy discussing engineering theory while $600,000 sank deeper into Iowa. Mud wasn't solving anything. Magnified torque doesn't matter if you can't get traction. Bill Thompson had looked at him with those bright blue eyes. "That's the other half. Your bulldozers spread 50 tons over rubber tracks maybe 15 feet long each. Ground pressure runs about 8.2 psi, give or take." Matthew Clark had been writing now, pen moving across his notepad. "About that, yes. Right. And on soft ground, that's too much. Tracks sink, Can't grip spin out." The old man had gestured with his hands, showing what he meant. "My engine puts 22 tons on 2 drive wheels, 6 feet in diameter, 16 inches wide. But here's the key: steel cleats. Not rubber, steel." He'd used his hands to demonstrate fingers curved like a wheel. Imagine a wheel with teeth. That's what cleats are. Every 8 inches around the wheel there's a steel bar, 2 inches tall, 16 inches wide, angle cut to bite. When that wheel rotates, each cleat punches down into earth, not sliding on top, biting through. Brandon had leaned forward, so it doesn't matter if the surface is soft, because the cleats punch through to solid ground underneath. Bill Thompson had nodded pleased, like the difference between walking on snow in boots versus snowshoes. Your bulldozers are snowshoes spreading weight, floating, slipping. My engine is boots punching through to solid ground below. The logic had made sense. Christopher had felt it making sense, which irritated him more than the mockery had. This old man with his old machine was explaining engineering principles to a crowd of professional construction workers, and the explanation held water. Matthew Clark had spoken up, but even with traction, you'd need sustained pulling power. "What about your engine's protection systems?" Bill Thompson had looked at the young engineer. "Protection systems? Modern machinery has sensors, computer controls. When they detect wheels slipping or load exceeding safe parameters, they reduce power automatically to prevent damage." Bill Thompson's expression had shifted, something like understanding crossing his weathered features. "That's your problem right there. Your machines protect themselves. Smart engineering extends machine life, prevents damage. But it means when the job gets hard, when resistance is too much, they back off. They quit." He'd patted the air like he was patting machinery. "My steam engine doesn't have a computer, no sensors, no automatic shutoff. I open that throttle she pulls until either the job's done or I tell her to stop. The only computer is me, and I know when to stop and when to keep pulling." The silence that fell this time had a different quality. Not mockery, something closer to consideration. Matthew Clark had stopped writing, pen hovering over paper. Several workers had moved closer, listening now instead of laughing. Christopher had felt the ground shifting under him, and not just the literal ground with its hidden swamps and underground springs. The ground of certainty, the foundation of assumptions he'd built 20 years on. Newer was better. Modern meant superior. Technology trumped experience. These things had been true. They'd built his company. They'd built his life. Bill Thompson had just suggested they might not be true. Christopher's voice had come out harder than he'd intended. "That's a nice theory, Mr. Thompson, but theory doesn't move 60 tons of stuck excavator." Bill Thompson's response had been simple, delivered with that same unshakable calm. "No, it doesn't. That's why I came to do it, not talk about it." The words had hung in the air, challenge and offer both. Christopher had looked at this old man, really looked at him. 73 if the math worked back from that 1887 barn marking. Spent his whole life on 400 acres, probably never been more than 50 miles from where he stood. What did he know about modern construction, about state contracts, about equipment worth more than most houses? But he knew something. The way he'd explained torque and traction hadn't been guesswork. That had been understanding built from decades of actual use, not theory read in manuals. Matthew Clark had leaned close, voice quiet. "Boss, we've got nothing else. Crane won't work. Helicopter's 15,000 an hour minimum." Christopher had looked at his excavator, at his career, at 20 years building and 3 days losing. Patricia's words echoed in his memory. "Your pride is going to destroy us. You need to ask for help." He'd turned back to Bill Thompson. "Say you try this. Say it fails. Then what? Then you've lost an hour of time. Same position you're in now. And if your machine breaks trying, that's my risk, not yours. What do you want for this?" How much Bill Thompson had shaken his head. "Don't want money." Christopher had felt suspicion rise. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had an angle. 20 years in construction taught you that. Everyone wants something. If it works, make a donation to Clayton County Historical Society. They helped me restore my engine few years back. Could use support. How much of a donation? Whatever you think is fair. If it works, and if it doesn't work, then you don't owe anything. I go home. You keep trying whatever you were going to try next. The deal had sounded too good. No risk, no upfront cost, no contract to sign, just a handshake and a promise to donate if this crazy plan somehow worked. Which it wouldn't, couldn't. A machine from 1912 pulling out a modern excavator that 50 tons of bulldozer couldn't move. It violated every principle of engineering Christopher knew. But he was out of options. Brandon had spoken again, voice careful but determined. "Dad, we should let him try. What do we have to lose?" Christopher had looked at his son, really looked at him maybe for the first time in months. The boy stood there with that notebook, 14 years old, trying to sound like a man, trying to impress a father who'd been too busy building an empire to notice his son was growing up. Patricia had been right about that too. He'd been losing his family while gaining everything else. "You think it'll work?" Brandon had met his eyes. "I think the physics make sense, and I think we're out of options." The truth of it had hit hard. Out of options. $4 million contract, 600,000 loss. Bankruptcy looming. Pride and assumptions worth less than dirt when the dirt was trying to swallow your livelihood whole. Christopher had turned to Bill Thompson. "Fine. Bring your museum piece, Mr. Thompson. But I'm telling you now, when it doesn't work, don't expect anything from me." Bill Thompson's expression hadn't changed. "Fair enough. I'll be back in 2 hours." 2 hours. Why so long? Got to fire up the boiler, build steam pressure. Can't rush steam. The old man had walked back to his John Deere with that same deliberate pace. He'd climbed up, started the engine, and driven away. The tractor had disappeared down the county road, dust settling in its wake. The construction crew had stood there in silence for a moment. Then someone had laughed. Then someone else. Soon enough, the whole site was chuckling, going back to work, shaking their heads at the absurdity. An old farmer with a steam engine from before World War I coming to save the day. It was ridiculous. Touching maybe in that way, old people being earnest about outdated things could be touching, but ridiculous. Matthew Clark had looked at Christopher. "Boss, you really think Christopher had cut him off?" "No, but we're desperate. So we'll watch him fail, then figure out Plan C." Brandon had stayed quiet, standing off to the side, writing in that notebook. The boy's face had carried an expression Christopher couldn't quite read. Not skepticism, something else, something like hope, mixed with certainty, the way people look when they know something others don't. The 2 hours had crawled past. Workers had returned to what jobs they could do, staying away from the swamp area. Christopher had made phone calls exploring helicopter options, not liking the numbers. 15,000 an hour, minimum 24-hour notice for deployment weather dependent, no guarantees on ground conditions. The math didn't work. Nothing worked. But what nobody in that circle of engineers and construction workers knew, what Christopher Anderson couldn't possibly have known, was that this wasn't just a machine to Bill Thompson. This was his grandfather's promise from 1912, his late wife's final project, and the last thing connecting him to the people he'd loved most. Samuel Thompson had bought that engine the same year the Titanic sank, had worked it for 25 years, had refused to scrap it when gasoline tractors made steam obsolete. He'd parked it in a shed and covered it with canvas, telling his grandson someday, "You'll understand why some things are worth keeping even when the world says they're done." Bill Thompson's wife, Linda, had spent her last 4 years helping restore that engine. Cancer had been eating her alive, but she'd polished brass fittings and painted details and researched parts, because sometimes the only way to fight death was to build something that would outlive you both. Her final words had been a whisper, hand gripping his arm. "Promise me you'll keep her running." And Bill Thompson had promised, the same way his grandfather had promised his grandmother a proper house. The same way promises had been kept in the Thompson family for 105 years. Not written down, not signed in blood, just spoken and meant and honored, because that's what made you who you were. In 2 hours, that promise would either prove everyone right to laugh, or teach every person on that construction site a lesson about humility they'd carry the rest of their lives. Christopher Anderson stood at the swamp's edge, watching his excavator sink another fraction of an inch. The September sun climbed higher. The cornfields rustled in the breeze. Somewhere, 2 miles away, an old man was building fire in a boiler that hadn't been designed to solve modern problems, only to keep pulling until the job was done, or the man said, "Stop." The world kept turning. The swamp kept claiming. And Christopher kept learning what every proud man eventually learns, that sometimes salvation comes from the places you're too arrogant to look, in the hands you're too dismissive to shake from the wisdom you're too modern to hear. The drive back to the farm took Bill Thompson through fields he'd known since birth. The John Deere rattled along County Road 40, engine steady at 30 miles per hour, taking the curves without hurry. Corn stood tall on both sides, ready for harvest within the week. The stalks had that particular late September gold that meant the growing season had done its job. Beyond the corn, soybeans stretched in darker green rows, leaves beginning their turn toward autumn yellow. The same fields his father had farmed, the same dirt his grandfather had broken from raw prairie. The land remembered things people forgot. Bill could read it the way some men read newspapers, that low spot by the creek where water pooled every spring, the rise near the county line where topsoil ran 8 feet deep, the stretch along the old Morrison property where underground springs ran close enough to surface that no amount of drainage would ever make it truly solid. He'd known that swamp was there, had known it since he was old enough to walk those fields with his father. The construction company's surveyors hadn't known, because knowing required more than instruments and computers, required memory, required the kind of understanding that came from generations of watching water move through earth. Samuel Thompson had arrived in Iowa in 1887 with a wife, a wagon, and $300, saved from 10 years of working other people's land. The prairie had been raw, then unbroken sod, thick enough to dull a plow blade in a single pass. He'd bought 160 acres for $2 an acre money he'd saved penny by penny, and Anna Thompson had cried when she saw what her husband's savings had purchased. Not from disappointment, from relief that they finally owned something nobody could take away. The first year they'd lived in a sod house, dirt floor walls cut from prairie earth roof made from whatever Samuel could salvage. Anna had cooked over a fire pit dug into the ground. They'd slept under blankets that never quite kept out the cold, but it was theirs. That mattered more than comfort. Samuel had spent 15 years clearing that land, rocks pulled from soil by hand and horse, stumps dynamited when they wouldn't budge, prairie sod broken and re-broken until it would accept seed. By 1902 he'd had crops. By 1907 he'd built the white farmhouse 2 stories with a wraparound porch, just like he'd promised Anna. The same house visible from the construction site. The same house where Bill had been born in 1919, where he'd lived every day of his 73 years. 1912 had been a good year. The farm had turned profit for the 5th straight season. Samuel had money saved enough to consider expansion, maybe another 80 acres. Anna had sat him down at the kitchen table one evening in March, laid her hand over his, told him to buy that steam engine he'd been talking about for 3 years. Samuel had argued $3,200, more than the farm had cost, more than they'd spent on anything except land and house. Anna's response had stayed in family memory. You kept your promise to me. Now keep your promise to yourself. The Case steam traction engine had arrived from Racine, Wisconsin in June of 1912, shipped by rail to Dubuque, hauled the final 30 miles by 6-horse team. Samuel had spent 2 weeks learning to operate. Had nearly killed himself twice. Getting the pressure wrong burned his hand badly enough to leave scars. Anna would kiss every night for the next 35 years, but he'd learned. And once he'd learned, the Thompson steam engine became known across 3 counties. Fall harvest meant threshing work. Samuel would fire up the Case in early September, spend the next 8 weeks pulling the threshing machine from farm to farm. 60-mile radius, working dawn to dark, separating wheat from chaff, while farmers paid good money for the service. The engine earned back its purchase price in 4 years. After that, pure profit. Samuel used that profit to buy the additional 80 acres, then another 80. By 1920, Thompson Farm stood at 320 acres, and the steam engine had paid for most of it. The gasoline tractors had started appearing in the late 20s. Farmall John Deere International Harvester. Easier to operate, cheaper to run, didn't require 3 hours of fire building every morning. By 1937, most farmers had scrapped their steam engines, sold them for metal value during Depression years when $300 could save a farm. Samuel had refused. That engine had earned this land, he'd told Anna. She stays. He'd parked it in a special shed built for the purpose, covered it with canvas tarps, told his grandson, young Bill, that someday the boy would understand why some things stayed valuable even after the world moved on. Bill's earliest memory had him at 5 years old, small enough that his grandfather had to lift him onto the engine's platform. The smell of coal smoke had been overwhelming, thick and sulphurous, not unpleasant, but powerful enough to burn nose and throat. The sound of the whistle when Samuel pulled the cord had made Bill's chest vibrate, a shriek of steam that carried for miles. And underneath it all, the steady chunk, chunk, chunk of pistons firing the feel of power moving through iron and steel. The sense that this machine represented something permanent in a world that kept changing. Samuel's words had stayed with him. This engine is a promise, boy. Hard work, dedication, never giving up even when the ground gets soft and the pull gets hard. Your grandmother and I built this farm on promises kept. You remember that. Bill had remembered. His father, Richard, had taken over the farm when Samuel died in '47. Richard had been a practical man focused on yields and markets, less interested in preserving the past than securing the future. The steam engine had stayed under its canvas in the shed, unfired, gathering dust and rust. Too busy farming to play with antiques, Richard would say when Bill asked about it. Got real work to do. Richard had died young, heart attack during harvest. 1963, 52 years old, and gone before the ambulance made it halfway from town. Bill had been 24, married 2 years, suddenly responsible for 400 acres, and a widow mother who didn't speak for 3 months. Linda Davis had walked into Bill Thompson's life at the Clayton County Fair in 1959. She'd been visiting relatives from Cedar Rapids, teaching 5th grade in the city, wearing a blue dress that caught his eye from across the exhibition hall. Bill had never been smooth with words, had barely traveled beyond 50 miles from the farm, knew more about soil composition than conversation. But he'd asked her to dance, and she'd said yes, and something had started that felt like the beginning of every important thing. They'd courted for 2 years. Linda driving down from Cedar Rapids on weekends, Bill making the trip north when he could spare time from farm work. She'd loved the land immediately in a way city people rarely did. Not romanticizing it, not treating it like a vacation, understanding that it was work and weather and responsibility that never stopped. When he'd proposed in '61, kneeling in the same field where his grandfather had first broken sod, she'd cried and said yes before he'd finished the question. No children came. Medical reasons the doctors explained with clinical precision that did nothing to soften the loss. But Linda had filled their life with other things, teaching at the one-room schoolhouse 5 miles down the county road, organizing community events, tending a garden that produced vegetables for half the county, making the farmhouse into a home that held more warmth than Samuel's had ever managed. 1984 had brought the diagnosis. Breast cancer stage 2, caught early enough that treatment had options. Linda had undergone surgery, radiation, enough poison pumped into her veins to kill cells, good and bad alike. The treatment had worked. The cancer had retreated. But the fight had left her exhausted, hollowed out, staring at walls with eyes that had lost their spark. The doctor had pulled Bill aside after one appointment. She needs a project, something to focus on besides illness, something that makes her feel alive. Bill had looked at his wife, sitting in the hospital waiting room, shoulders hunched, spirit dimmed. He'd thought about promises and legacy and things worth saving. I've got a project. The restoration had taken 4 years. Samuel's steam engine had sat untouched for 37 years, by then hidden under canvas that had rotted through, in places rust claiming metal wherever moisture found purchase. Linda had pulled back the tarps with Bill that first afternoon in May of '84, stood looking at the machine in silence for a full minute before speaking. Your grandfather would want this running again. They'd worked slowly, some weeks just cleaning a single component, removing decades of accumulated grime with wire brushes and solvents. Linda had tackled the brass fittings, polishing them until they gleamed like new. She'd sewn canvas covers for the parts they'd restored, protecting them from the Iowa weather. She'd made phone calls to museums and collectors, tracking down original parts when replacements were needed, writing letters in her careful teacher's handwriting to elderly men who still remembered the steam era. Bill had found a retired machinist in Dubuque, 82 years old, hands still steady enough to turn a lathe. The man had worked on steam engines in his youth, remembered the specifications, could recreate parts that no longer existed anywhere except in fading blueprints. Together, they'd rebuilt the governor, repacked the piston seals, replaced worn gears with new ones machined to tolerances that would have impressed Samuel himself. The work had given Linda purpose. Bill would find her in the shed on days when she should have been resting polishing brass or researching history, or just sitting beside the engine talking to it like it could hear. The cancer had stayed away during those years. 4 years of respite, 4 years of building something together, 4 years that felt like grace. October of '87 had brought the first test fire. The boiler had been pressure tested, the firebox repaired, every seal and valve checked and rechecked. Bill had built the fire with hands that shook, slightly nervous about getting it wrong after so much work. Linda had stood beside him, one hand resting on his arm, watching the pressure gauge climb. 50 psi, 75, 100, 125. When the gauge hit operating pressure, Bill had pulled the whistle cord. The sound that emerged had been pure and clear steam shrieking through brass polished to mirror brightness, echoing across Thompson land for the first time since 1947. Linda had started crying, laughing, through tears, gripping his arm hard enough to leave marks. Samuel would be so proud, she'd said. So would Anna. That night had been the best of Bill's life. They'd sat on the porch, long after dark, Linda's head on his shoulder, talking about nothing and everything. The cancer had seemed distant. The future had seemed possible. The engine had represented promise-kept legacy, honored, something built together that would outlast them both. Spring of '88 had brought the cancer back. Different location this time, more aggressive, responding poorly to treatment. 6 months from diagnosis to death, April to October, leaves turning gold, just like they'd been that night on the porch. Linda had spent her last weeks in the farmhouse in the bedroom they'd shared for 27 years, morphine keeping the pain at bay, but clouding her mind to the point where Bill wasn't sure she knew him anymore. The final day, she'd been lucid for an hour. Mid-October afternoon light slanting through the bedroom window, turning everything the color of autumn. Linda had gripped his hand with strength that surprised him, pulled him close, made him meet her eyes. Her voice, when it came, had been barely a whisper, but the words had carried weight. Promise me you'll keep her running. Bill had known immediately what she meant. Not keep her alive. That was already lost. Keep the engine running. Keep the promise to Samuel, to Anna, to every Thompson who'd worked this land. Keep something permanent in a world where everything else kept slipping away. I promise. Linda had died 3 hours later, 59 years old, taking with her every ounce of warmth the farmhouse had ever held. Bill had buried her in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Thompson Land, same plot where Samuel and Anna rested, same earth that had claimed Richard and generations before. The headstone had been simple. Linda Davis Thompson, 1929 to 1988, beloved wife, teacher, keeper of promises. Bill fired the engine once a month after that. Not because it needed running that often, though. Regular operation did help keep seals fresh and parts moving. He fired it because he'd promised, because Linda had asked, and he'd said yes, and Thompson men kept their word. Every month for 4 years, building fire and pressure, listening to that whistle echo across the land, hearing Linda's laugh in the sound. Yesterday's rescue hadn't been about proving Christopher Anderson wrong, hadn't been about showing off an antique or making modern equipment look foolish. It had been about keeping a promise to a woman who'd spent her last 4 years making sure her husband had something to hold on to when she was gone. Bill pulled the John Deere into the farm lane tires, crunching on familiar gravel. The shed stood behind the barn, same structure Samuel had built in 37, same canvas tarps Bill and Linda had replaced in 86. He parked the tractor, climbed down, walked to the shed with the deliberate pace of a man who'd learned long ago that rushing never helped. The canvas came off in sections, folded carefully and set aside. Underneath sat the case steam traction engine, exactly as Samuel had commissioned it in 1912. 22 tons of iron and steel and brass built before World War I, older than most counties in Iowa. The boiler stretched 6 feet long, 4 feet in diameter, painted black and polished to a gleam. The smokestack rose 8 feet tall, brass cap catching the midday light. Drive wheels stood 6 feet in diameter. Steel rims 16 inches wide, cleats protruding every 8 inches around the circumference like teeth on a massive gear. The platform behind the boiler held the operator's station, wooden deck weathered smooth by decades of use, controls positioned where a standing man could reach them comfortably. Throttle lever on the left, brass handle worn to a dull shine. Brake on the right, operated by foot pedal. Steering wheel, dead center, connected to the front wheels through a system of chains and gears. Gauges mounted at eye level, water level, steam pressure, fire temperature. Everything a man needed to operate 22 tons of pulling power, all controlled by muscle and judgment, and the kind of understanding that only came from doing. The lettering on the boiler side stood clear and proud. J.I. Case Company, Racine, Wisconsin, 1912. Below that, in smaller script, serial number 4847, built to order for Samuel Thompson, Clayton County, Iowa. Bill opened the water inlet and connected the garden hose. The boiler held 150 gallons when full, needed 120 for safe operation. Water flowed in with a hollow sound that changed pitch as the level rose, creating a music Bill had heard 1,000 times. He watched the gauge climb, checking for leaks around the sight glass, finding none. Linda had replaced those seals in 86, done the work herself, with hands that could barely grip the wrench some days. The seals held perfect. The firebox door opened with a squeal of hinges that needed oil. Bill made a mental note to fix that later after today's work was done. Inside the firebox showed clean grates, ash cleared from the last firing 2 weeks previous. He'd run the engine then just for maintenance building pressure and letting it idle for an hour, keeping everything moving. No job to do, no load to pull, just the monthly promise kept. Building the fire required sequence and patience. Newspaper first wadded loosely to allow airflow. Kindling next small pieces of oak split thin enough to catch fast. Then coal, starting with pieces the size of walnuts, building up to chunks the size of softballs. The coal bin beside the engine held 500 pounds of anthracite ordered special from a supplier in Pennsylvania because anthracite burned cleaner and hotter than the soft coal most people used. 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit when the fire got going, hot enough to turn water to steam at pressure that could drive pistons powerful enough to move mountains. Bill struck a match, held it to the newspaper, watched flames spread across the wadded pages. Kindling caught next crackling and popping smoke, rising white, before the coal started burning. He fed coal gradually, closing the firebox door part way to control airflow, watching through the small vent window as the fire built from yellow flames to orange to the deep red glow that meant the anthracite had caught properly. The waiting began. Couldn't rush steam. Physics didn't care about schedules or desperate construction companies or excavators sinking into swamps. Water needed time to heat to reach the 212 degrees where it transitioned to vapor to build pressure as that vapor expanded in the confined space of the boiler. The process took 90 minutes minimum if everything went right. Bill had learned patience through 7 decades of farming, through 4 years of watching cancer steal his wife, through a lifetime of understanding that some things happened in their own time regardless of human desire. He used the waiting to inspect the engine. Oil ports got fresh lubricant applied with a pump can Linda had bought at an estate sale in '85. The drive chain received attention, each link checked for wear. Tension adjusted where needed. Wheel bearings got examined, though they'd been repacked just last month and showed no sign of trouble. The chain that would do today's pulling lay coiled on the rear platform, 80-ton rated forged steel links, 2 inches thick, 100 feet long. The same chain Samuel had used for threshing work, never broken in 80 years, despite loads that should have snapped lesser steel. The pressure gauge began its climb. 10 psi, 25, 50. The needle moved with agonizing slowness, tracking the transformation of water to steam liquid to gas, potential to power. Bill checked his watch. 1 hour since lighting the fire. Pressure at 75 psi and rising steady. He thought about Christopher Anderson standing beside that swamp, pride wounded but not yet broken. Bill had seen that look before, worn it himself in younger years. The certainty that modern meant better, that experience could be replaced with equipment, that technology trumped wisdom. Life had a way of teaching otherwise, usually through pain, occasionally through grace. Samuel had taught him that some machines don't become obsolete when newer models arrive. They just wait for the moment when their particular combination of qualities matters again. Slow speed didn't matter when you needed pulling power that wouldn't quit. Old design didn't matter when that design solved problems new machines couldn't touch. And sometimes the answer to tomorrow's challenge had been sitting in a shed for 50 years, waiting for someone to remember what it was built to do. The pressure gauge hit 100 psi, 115, 125. The sweet spot was 135, high enough to provide power, low enough to stay well clear of the safety valve's 160 release point. Bill added 3 shovels of coal, closed the firebox door, fully watched the gauge stabilize at 137 psi. He climbed onto the platform boots, finding familiar positions on wood worn smooth. Left hand on the throttle, right hand releasing the brake. The throttle moved with resistance that came from steam pressure fighting against the valve, wanting to rush through, held back by brass and leverage and a man's grip. A quarter turn opened the throttle. Steam rushed into the cylinders, driving pistons that connected to the crankshaft, turning reduction gears that rotated the drive wheels. The sound began low and deep, chunk, 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 the rhythm of reciprocating power. 9-inch piston stroke repeated twice per second. The wheels turned slowly, steel cleats catching the dirt floor of the shed, pulling 22 tons forward with the steady inevitability of continental drift. Bill guided the engine out of the shed into September sunlight that turned the black boiler into a mirror and made the brass fittings glow like captured fire. Down the farm lane, past the barn Samuel had built in 1890, past the house where 3 generations of Thompsons had been born and died. Onto County Road 40, where gravel crunched under steel wheels and cleats bit deep enough to leave marks that would last through winter. The procession to the construction site took on ceremonial weight. Cars approaching from behind had to slow, trapped behind an iron giant moving at 5 miles per hour. Some drivers honked in frustration. Others, pulled to the shoulder, got out, took photographs of something they'd never seen moving under its own power. Jerry Davis, the mailman, stood beside his truck, grinning like Christmas morning. Bill hadn't seen her on the road in years. Children appeared in yards, running alongside, shouting questions. "Can I ride it? How fast does it go? What's it for?" Bill? Let the whistle answer, pulling the cord and sending a shriek of steam across Iowa farmland that made dogs bark and old-timers remember when such sounds had been common as birdsong. The sound carried. That particular frequency of steam forced through brass, impossible to mistake for anything else, penetrating walls and distance with the authority of approaching weather. People heard it in town, 3 miles away, looked up from whatever they were doing, exchanged glances. Someone's fired up a steam engine, only one steam engine in the county. Bill Thompson's case, which meant Bill Thompson had work to do. Brandon Anderson heard it from the construction site, head coming up like a deer scenting wind. The boy had been standing apart from the workers, writing in that notebook, probably working through the physics of what Bill had explained earlier. His face lit up with excitement that made him look younger than 14, made him look like a kid watching something impossible become real. The boy ran to his father, words tumbling out too fast. "Dad, he's coming. I can hear the engine." Christopher Anderson stepped out of his truck where he'd been making phone calls, trying options that didn't exist. He stood listening to that distant sound growing closer, face unreadable pride and desperation fighting for control of his expression. The construction crew stopped working. 40 men and women putting down tools, shutting off equipment, gathering near the swamp to watch. Word had spread about the old farmer and his museum piece. Most expected entertainment, the kind that came from watching well-meaning amateurs fail at professional work. Some expected nothing, figured the old man wouldn't show. Nobody expected salvation. The sound grew from distant to present to overwhelming. The county road curved over a small rise a quarter-mile from the construction site. Smoke appeared first, black column rising above the trees, visible against clear September sky. Then the smokestack itself, brass cap catching light. Then the full machine cresting the rise like some iron dinosaur returning to reclaim Earth. Distance made it seem to move slowly, but that was illusion born of size. The case covered ground with steady purpose, 5 miles per hour, sustained the kind of pace that could be maintained all day without strain. Black boiler gleaming, brass fittings throwing back sunlight like signal mirrors, drive wheels turning with the measured rhythm of inevitability, cleats flashing with each rotation. Steam hissing from relief valves in white clouds that trailed behind like banner. Bill stood on the platform, one hand on the throttle, the other on the steering wheel, guiding 22 tons with the casual competence of 7 decades' practice. He looked straight ahead, focused on the path, reading the ground for soft spots and grades, making constant, tiny adjustments that kept the engine moving smooth. At a quarter-mile out, Bill pulled the whistle cord. The sound that emerged silenced every other noise on that construction site. Pure steam blast forced through brass, shrill and powerful, carrying the kind of authority that made spines straighten and attention focus. Every person stopped, turned, stared at the approaching machine. The whistle echoed off the equipment, off the parked trucks, off the swamp water itself, creating harmonics that made the air vibrate. Workers who'd been laughing earlier weren't laughing now. The scale became apparent as the engine drew closer. Not toy-sized, not novelty-sized, war machine-sized, a mobile boiler built to generate power that could pull entire threshing rigs across muddy fields all day long. The kind of machinery men had used to break continents before electronics and computers and safety systems made everything smaller and weaker and more cautious. Bill guided the case down the slope toward the swamp edge, reading the ground, positioning the engine 200 feet from the stuck excavator on soil he knew would hold. He set the brake with a hiss of pneumatic pressure, throttled down to idle, let the engine settle into quiet rumble that was more felt than heard. The construction crew had formed a semicircle, silent, watching. Bill climbed down from the platform with the careful movements of 73-year-old joints that had worked hard since before some of these workers' parents were born. His boots hit solid ground. He walked to the rear platform, began uncoiling the chain unspooled with metallic whisper, 100 feet of forged steel that had never failed Samuel, had never failed Bill, had pulled loads across terrain that should have been impossible. Each link measured 2 inches thick, weighing 5 pounds, capable of holding 80 tons of tensile load before the metal would even begin to stretch. Matthew Clark, the young engineer, found his voice. "Mr. Thompson, we snapped a cable rated for 50 tons. That chain," Bill's response, came without looking up from his work. "This chain's rated for 80, but that's not why it holds. Why then steel cable's rigid, hits its limit, snaps instant. No warning, chain's got elasticity, stretches a little before breaking, gives me time to feel it back off power if needed." Matthew pulled out his notebook, started writing. The engineer's skepticism had shifted to something closer to professional interest, the way good minds react when encountering new information that makes sense. Bill shouldered the chain, 100 feet, weighing 200 pounds, distributed across shoulders that had carried weight since childhood. He started walking toward the excavator boots, sinking into soft ground that grew softer with each step. The crew watched in silence as the old man waded through mud that rose from ankles to calves to knees, black muck sucking at each step, making progress an act of will. Brandon started forward, concern overriding whatever instructions his father had given about staying back. "Mr. Thompson, you need help," Bill's voice carried back without strain. "I got it, son." The excavator loomed larger as Bill approached 60 tons of yellow steel, half drowned in swamp water, cab tilted at an angle that suggested the whole machine might roll if disturbed wrong. Bill waded the final 20 feet water to his chest, now black and cold, and smelling of rot, and underground springs that had been feeding this swamp since before Europeans arrived in Iowa. He hooked the chain to the excavator's frame, finding the reinforcement point designed for exactly this kind of recovery. The hook slipped through, seated properly, tested with a yank that put his full weight behind it. Satisfied, Bill began the return journey, fighting mud that resisted every step, suction pulling at his boots, like hands trying to drag him down. The crew watched him emerge, covered head to boots in black muck that dripped and stank. Bill didn't acknowledge, it didn't wipe at his face, didn't show any sign that being coated in swamp water at 73 years old represented anything unusual. He walked straight to the engine, began securing the chain to the rear coupling point, movements methodical and practiced. Christopher Anderson approached, stopped a few feet away. The construction company owner's face showed conflict, pride, fighting necessity, arrogance, wrestling, desperation. His voice, when it emerged, carried a tone Bill recognized, the tone of a man about to draw a line, stake his pride on one final position before reality forced him to cross it. "Mr. Thompson, listen, that machine is worth $600,000. Bill checked the chain connection, tested the coupling with his full weight hanging from it. "I know. If something goes wrong, if that excavator shifts and the chain snaps wrong direction, it could kill someone." Bill stopped working, turned to face Christopher fully. "That's why everyone needs to back up 100 feet. You sure about this? Been pulling things with this engine for 40 years. Never lost a man yet." The words hung between them, carrying implications Christopher was only beginning to process. 40 years. This old man had been doing this work since before Christopher's company existed, before modern equipment made such rescues supposedly obsolete. The realization showed on Christopher's face, assumptions cracking. Bill's voice carried flat authority. "Everybody back 100 feet from the chain line. Now!" The crew retreated without argument, something in Bill's tone bypassing the usual construction site hierarchy. Brandon stayed close to the engine, positioning himself behind it, where the chain's path couldn't reach. Christopher stood frozen between retreating and watching, torn between leadership and the desperate need to see if this impossible thing might actually work. Bill climbed back onto the platform, checked the gauges. Water level, good pressure, holding at 140 psi. Fire burning steady with enough coal to maintain heat. He added 3 shovels anyway, the kind of preparation that came from knowing exactly how much steam the next few minutes would consume. Closed the firebox door, fully secured it against the pressure. His hands found their positions, left on throttle, right poised over brake release, eyes forward locked on the excavator 200 feet distant. The chain stretched between them in a straight line, taut but not tensioned, waiting for power to flow. Bill took a breath, thought about Samuel pulling threshing machines through autumn mud, thought about Linda polishing brass fittings while cancer ate her alive, thought about promises made and kept, about legacy and duty and the weight of family expectations carried across generations. His hand moved. Quarter turn on the throttle. The engine responded instantly. The quiet rumble became a roar, chunk-chunk, transforming to chunk-chunk pistons firing faster steam, rushing through cylinders, driving power through reduction gears to the drive wheels. The wheels began turning slow at first, one revolution every 3 seconds, cleats biting into earth with methodical precision. The chain went taut. Slack disappeared links, aligning into a perfect line, connecting engine to excavator, potential energy becoming tensile force. The chain began to hum, a sound metal makes under stress, vibrating at frequencies that made teeth ache. In the excavator's cab, loose items rattled. The whole machine groaned, 60 tons of steel, stressed by forces it wasn't designed to experience. Metal flexing hydraulic seals, compressing the sound of engineering, pushed toward its limits. Nothing moved. Bill pushed the throttle halfway. The engine's roar intensified, chunk, 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 becoming a continuous thunder steam pressure dropping from 140 to 138 to 135 as consumption outpaced generation. The drive wheels spun faster, 2 revolutions per second, now cleats punching into earth with the steady rhythm of an industrial hammer. The cleats didn't spin uselessly. Each one bit down, penetrating through soft surface to solid ground beneath gripping substrate that had been compressed under geological time. 6 feet of wheel diameter meant each cleat traveled 18 feet of circumference before coming around again. With 8 cleats per wheel, that meant a cleat hitting ground every 2¼ feet of forward progress. Continuous grip, continuous pull. No slipping, no spinning, just 22 tons of mass backed by reduction-geared torque, finding purchase where modern rubber couldn't. The excavator moved, an inch, maybe 2, barely perceptible except that black water rippled around the cab, disturbed by shift that broke 3 days of static equilibrium. Brandon's voice cut through the engine noise, young and excited and disbelieving. It moved Bill didn't hear, focused entirely on the feel of the engine beneath his feet, the sound of the chain, the pressure gauge dropping slowly toward 130 psi. He knew without looking that he had maybe 3 minutes before steam pressure dropped too low to maintain pull. 3 minutes to move 60 tons across 50 feet of soft ground to solid earth. 3 minutes, or the excavator stayed buried. 3/4 throttle. The engine screamed now. Chunk, 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 becoming a continuous roar that drowned out everything else. Pressure dropping faster, 130 to 128 to 125. The wheels threw mud behind in continuous spray cleats churning earth, but not spinning, gripping, pulling, moving forward with the steady inevitability of glacial ice. The chain stretched, visibly elongated steel molecules rearranging under 80,000 pounds of tension, the kind of load that would have snapped rigid cable instantly. But chain had give. The links stretched, deformed, slightly absorbed stress through elasticity that allowed the pull to sustain instead of breaking catastrophic. Christopher's voice somewhere in the background, panic rising. It's going to snap. Bill's hand hovered over the throttle, ready to back off if the chain's vibration frequency changed in the way that meant imminent failure. But the sound stayed steady. High-pitched keening, yes, but constant, controlled. The chain was holding. The excavator lurched forward. 6 inches this time, then a foot. The mud released its grip with a sucking sound that carried across the construction site, audible even over the engine's roar. The tracks began emerging black and dripping, rising from swamp water that had held them prisoner for 3 days. The construction crew erupted, 40 voices shouting, not in panic, but in disbelief, in the kind of shock that comes from watching impossible become real. Men were running forward, stopping when they remembered the 100-foot rule, jumping and pointing and grabbing each other's arms. Bill maintained throttle position. The excavator was moving, now momentum building, resistance decreasing, as more of the machine's weight found solid ground instead of swamp bottom. 5 feet, 10 feet. The tracks fully visible now, dripping mud in rivers, hydraulic lines intact. The machine fundamentally sound despite 3 days submerged. 20 feet, 30 feet. The excavator rose from the swamp like resurrection yellow paint, visible again beneath the black coating, the cab level, for the first time since Kevin Harris had scrambled out Sunday morning. The sound of suction breaking filled the air mud, releasing its grip section by section, each surrender marked by wet, tearing sounds that suggested the earth giving up a fight it had never wanted to win. The pressure gauge read 115 psi, dropping below operational ideal, but still enough. Still pulling. Bill watched the ground ahead, knowing every inch of this land, knowing exactly where soft earth transitioned to solid. The excavator's tracks touched that boundary, found purchase, began to grip instead of drag. 50 feet, 75. The excavator sat fully on solid ground now, first time in 3 days, tracks biting earth instead of floating in muck. Bill closed the throttle. The engine wound down, chunk, 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 fading to chunk, chunk, chunk to quiet rumble. The chain went slack, tension releasing steel links, settling back to rest configuration. Silence fell across the construction site. Not total silence. The engine still breathed its quiet rumble. Workers still shuffled. Wind still moved through the corn across the road. But comparative silence, the kind that followed miracles. Bill reached for the whistle cord, pulled. The sound that emerged carried triumph. Pure steam blast forced through brass polished by Linda's hands, echoing across Iowa farmland with the same authority it had carried in 1912 when Samuel first sounded it. The same note that had announced threshing crew arrivals, that had celebrated harvests completed, that had marked moments when work met success through stubborn refusal to quit. The construction crew exploded, men shouting, embracing hard hats, flying through the air. Brandon sprinting toward the engine, face alight with joy that made him look like the kid he still was underneath the teenage seriousness. Matthew Clark staring at his stopwatch, 3 minutes, 17 seconds, writing frantically, trying to capture what he'd just witnessed in engineering terms that might make sense later. Bill shut down the engine properly. Damper closed, restricting air to the firebox. Throttle fully closed. Brakes set. Pressure beginning its slow bleed through relief valves, 115 dropping to 110 to 105. The ritual of shutdown, as important as startup, the kind of procedure that kept machinery running for 80 years. Brandon reached the engine first, chest heaving from the sprint. Mr. Thompson, that was incredible. Bill climbed down joints, protesting, mud-covered and tired, and 73 years old. She did good work today. Can you teach me how to operate her? The question stopped Bill mid-step. He looked at this boy, this 14-year-old who'd watched his father dismiss the old ways, who'd defended the possibility when everyone laughed, who understood on some level that wisdom didn't come with warranties. You want to learn, yes, sir, everything about her. Come by the farm Saturday morning. Bring work gloves. Christopher Anderson stood 50 yards away alone while his crew celebrated. The man's face had gone pale expression, blank posture, rigid. He watched the excavator sitting on solid ground, watched his son talking with Bill Thompson, watched his entire worldview realizing it had been built on assumptions that just shattered. Patricia Anderson's car pulled up hasty parking, suggesting she'd driven fast once news reached her. She ran toward the excavator, toward her husband, voice carrying relief and fear and anger all mixed together. Christopher! It worked. Christopher didn't respond, just stood staring at the steam engine, at the ancient obsolete museum piece that had accomplished what millions of dollars of modern equipment couldn't touch. Bill began the shutdown ritual, bleeding pressure, cleaning the firebox grate, preparing the engine for the drive home. Workers approached with questions, requests for photos, expressions of awe that made Bill uncomfortable. He answered briefly, posed for pictures because refusing seemed churlish, deflected praise toward the machine itself. The drive home took another hour, the case moving at its steady 5-mile-per-hour pace, trailing celebration and disbelief, and the kind of story people would tell for decades. Cars honked in celebration now instead of frustration. People lined the county road, waving as the engine passed. Jerry Davis, the mailman, had his camera out, taking photos for the paper. Brandon stood beside his father and mother, watching the engine disappear down the county road. The boy's voice carried wonder. "Dad, that was the most amazing thing I've ever seen." Christopher's response came quiet, distant, a man processing truths he'd spent 20 years avoiding. "Yeah, it was." The steam engine crested the rise smokestack, visible until it dropped below the horizon. The sound of the whistle echoed one final time, carrying across farmland where promises had been kept since 1887, where machines built before World War I still pulled their weight, where old didn't mean useless and new didn't mean better. Just meant understanding what you actually needed versus what you thought progress required.